Today we are going to talk about the comparisons between the migrations or the Swedish immigration to the United States versus the Somali migration to Sweden. That movement, mass movement of people migrating to the United States from Sweden took place 150 years or more ago. And we compare that immigration to the Somali immigrants coming from Somalia to Sweden. So what are the similarities of these two migrations, and what are their differences? And what can we learn from these migrations, especially from the Swedish immigration to America? What can we learn from that migration in order to apply these lessons from which we learned this immigration into the current migration of Somalis to Sweden? But first, we have to know what are the similarities of these two migrations and what are the differences of these migrations. The similarities is that both communities have left countries that have been forced by certain circumstances, and these circumstances forced them to leave their own country. In the Swedish context, it was the famine. But they knew where they were going. They knew that they will eventually end up in America. In the Somali context, the migration was just from hunger, famine, war, instability, terrorism, disintegration, all these things. And unfortunately, the people did not know where they will end up. And most of us, we have come now from refugee camps, where we waited for a long time for donors to come, or countries that have got a quota of refugees to take to their countries. But in the Swedish context, they just moved it according to their own will. But there was still something forcing them to go. They couldn't stay behind because of the circumstances of famine, of hunger, of to some extent religious problems, as historical facts say. And the same way, the Somalis, they did not have any option to stay behind other than to leave. But they did not know where they would end up. And that has brought a great difference between the two migrations. That in one part, the migration took place in a way that the families moved together to another country. But on the other side, it has brought a problem of family dismemberment. That all the people have run away without even knowing where the family members are. And they ended up in refugee camps. And even those families who, by virtue of, say, of circumstances, united in the refugee camp, later on have been divided by their circumstances themselves, by a situation which the donors would allow to take some people from this camp and some other from that camp. And that has led to a great family disintegration and dismemberment. We are very grateful to these countries that has taken the refugee and has brought people to their own countries. But there has been some kind of family dismemberment that has been brought by these people who are living in different camps and who do not know until now where their other members of the families ended up in the world at the moment. So that was one fact that makes the two immigrations different. And the circumstances under which they traveled or migrated is still different, although they have got some kind of similarities. In the case of Swedish, they moved by boat or by ship. Let me say ship, because they had to cross the Atlantic. And but in the Somali case, they moved by road. By some of them walked into refugee camps after spending days and days and weeks and months in the forests. Some of them have traveled by plane, maybe, and then ended up in certain countries that they had to request some kind of asylum. maybe within Africa or outside of Africa, maybe joining refugee camps in the border of this, in countries that share borders with Somalia. So the migration was quite different. I mean, the circumstances under which the people have migrated is different. As we have learned quite recently, and we still have to look for the facts to prove that this is true. As we have learned, the first Swedish immigrants who moved away from Sweden started their journey from a place called Kisa. The first Swedish group that has taken a boat or a ship to go to America. And this group, when they ended up in America, they have reconnected their own people. But the groups that left Somalia, maybe in the first days of the war or maybe later days, until now people are moving from Somalia, they don't have any means of reconnecting with their people, apart from the telephone connections which has been established quite recently. But in the beginning, it was quite difficult to find out where are the family members you had left behind are living at the moment. It was quite difficult. So the connection, which shows that in one place the country was intact, and they had got possibilities to send mail. Until now, we don't have post office services. No one can send a letter to his family. We can use only the internet and the telephone calls. And imagine when there was war and people were fleeing and there was no internet connection and there was no telephone installations and there was no postal services, how were people coping with that situation to reconnect with their people back home? In the Swedish case, it was quite good because the Americans were so highly developed nation, and the Swedish people were, in fact, even though they were migrating, the country was intact in infrastructure-wise. So they had connections with their own families. We do not have that kind of connection. We only started quite recently when these facilities arrived. And the most important thing is that this disintegration did not allow people to rebuild their own country, whilst the Swedish people who worked in America had sent money to their families, which was being used to reconstruct the country. Even if they had established business for their own kinships, it was quite good because it was part of the wider development scheme of the nation. But in our case, money we send back to the country ends up to our own immediate families. That is still good, but it doesn't empower, it doesn't enrich, it doesn't take part in the national reconstruction of the country. It only goes into pockets that, or sources that have got some kind of a relationship with the sources that send the money. So even reconstructing the country with the money generated from the diaspora was quite good in the Swedish context, more than in the Somali context. But I still say it is good that we send money. I send money now, but I send to my very close relatives. And any money sent to the country is not levied, not taxed. So no part of that money goes to a state which can use this money to build the schools or roads or something like that, because we lack this infrastructure and centrality of a state which can control the flow of money from abroad to the country. So that was another disadvantage that we have found out in our research to find out the similarities and differences of these two migrations. And in fact, the nature of migration, as we talked about, was almost the same, and the reasons were almost the same, but the challenges of integration, when they have already resettled themselves into the new environments, the integration challenges they have met was quite different. We are still lagging behind as Somalis in the diaspora than most of the communities that have sought asylum in Europe and America. In fact, in America, it's very good because the Somalis are one of the most dynamic communities that are resettled in America in terms of entrepreneurship and in terms of cohesion, in terms of solidarity, in terms of all these things. But in Europe, we lag far behind from other communities coming from other countries. The disintegration of the country has so much deepened our situation of deprivation, of isolation, of living in a situation where we cannot reconstruct our people, reestablish ourselves as a viable potential community in the diaspora, especially in Europe. So the challenges of integration, which people have met in these two different kinds of environments, has been quite different. In the Swedish side, it was quite good because they have associated themselves in terms of a community. Until now, we can find the traces of history of the first Swedish community that are settled in Minnesota, who have started their own community establishments, trying even to cook their own food, their own restaurants, and their own even tobacco, the type of tobacco they like to use, snus. So this is something quite good. And they have built their own churches. Most of them, in fact, when situation became very hard, they most often went to the church to seek help from God, of course. And that was an identity, really, to preserve. Because when people have lost their country or maybe left the country and loved ones behind and came to a new country where they cannot reconnect, where they cannot weave themselves into the streams of the framework of that nation, then they must find a way to live. And one of the ways the Swedish people have found to live was to go to the church. And that's why we have so much of people going very close to religious extremes in the diaspora now. It's just an instinct, a human instinct, that one should find some sort of an identity to at least find himself and prove himself and his existence to the other people and to himself. So they established themselves. But in the case of the Somalis, where we are at the moment, especially in Europe, we still have to go a long way to find ourselves as a community. But in America, we are really top. And I hope that will continue and will be replicated. That success will be replicated into many parts of Europe, especially in Sweden, where we are not doing so well in terms of entrepreneurship. The adjustments was quite good, in fact, and that is something that we have to be proud of in America. But in Sweden, we still have to go quite a long way. And I think that is the general overview of the project in which I'm working now. The project is called the Migration Stories Project. But in this context of program now, what we are talking about is the comparison of the two migrations. And that is the general overview of the similarities and the differences. But there are still more to talk about. But for today, we cut short and stop it here. Thank you very much. We start the second part, and that is how people find themselves after these migrations. Now, 150 years later, the Swedish people in Sweden, or the Swedish people, the Americans of Swedish origin in Minnesota, have got a possibility to trace down to the origins of their ancestors and find out where they have come from. And that's called genealogy. It's a program that has been installed in the computers at the moment. You know why? Because the time they were migrating, the Swedish country or the Swedish nation has had a very developed infrastructure in terms of recording. Although the church was in control at that time, they were recording the birth, the death, the movements, and they were issuing papers, travel papers, and they were taxing money or something like that. They had some kind of established administrative mechanism in the country, which was in place at the moment, at that time. But in the case of Somalia, we just ran away. No one has recorded our departures, where we were going, where we were going to end up. What will happen after 50 years? Our children will not know where we have come from, because there's no trace. Our history begins when we come to history, to Sweden, for example. And that's really pity, that I came to Sweden when I was more than 50 years old. Over 50 years old. And my children will know about my history only when I came to Sweden, because the Swedish people recorded my arrival and gave me phone numbers, and then from there they have been monitoring my progress in the country. And my children will know only that, because after that there's no any national statistics and national archives which the grandchildren can go back and dig in to find out where their grandfather or great-great-grandfather has come from. It's pity. What can we do about that? I have met, and in fact discussed it with friends and academicians, scholars, cultural people in the museums, and tried to find out how people find their people. And it's quite amazing that a friend of mine has immediately established where his great-grandmother left from in Sweden. It was Linköping, just with a computer. And even before she had left, he found out where she was born and where she lived and what she has been doing in her life. Can you imagine that kind of a progress? Because 150 years ago, there was established archive system or recording system in Sweden. We have had that kind of recording, but when the Civil War broke out, we destroyed everything. And now we don't have any kind of a trace of where we came from, unless we write ourselves and leave it for our children so that they will know where in the country we came from and what reasons we came for and why have left the country, what were the reasons that forced us to leave the country. These are the things we need to write now so that the grandchildren will know where their ancestors have come from before they came to Sweden. And that is genealogy. And the difference of the two migrations, if I go back to the first part of the program, one glaring difference is that one country has had a way to record the people at birth, at death, and during life of that person. But in one country, in the other country, whatever record they had, it has been destroyed, and people do not have, at the moment, any kind of a trace to find out their history. And a man or a woman or whatever it is, any kind of a person, a human being, who does not know his origins, his identities, his heritage, his roots, his history, I don't think can live like a human being. It's just, well, a dog does not know where originally he came from, and he doesn't care about it, what race he belongs to. But a human being should know where he came from, at least. And that's why people are finding each other now, finding themselves. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of a record. So the program is trying to find out which way can we mobilize the Somalis to find out their origins, to write their histories, to write their past, so that they will establish an identity of their own in their new countries and their new environments. And that would leave a legacy for their own children later on, after we have passed away. So one of the differences was this kind of recording. So the genealogical advantage of one country and the lack of it in another country. And that is something we have to be very careful about, because a person has to have some place to reconnect with, to find out who he is, where he came from. That's not necessary in this established, well-advanced technological world. I don't mind who I am, but it's good to find out where I came from and to find out who I am. It doesn't mean that if I'm black, if I'm white, if I'm Eskimo, if I'm a Somali, it makes difference for me. It doesn't make any difference. Race doesn't have any advantage or any kind of importance in this context. But to recognize you, where you came from, is really very important. That's why people are established by their names, by their numbers, and by their national origins, nationalities, and all these things, to find out. Otherwise, you cannot know who is who. Even you cannot know who you are. So that is why the program, this project, is trying to find out the similarities and differences. Now we know. We did not know that before. We just found out through this investigation and research of comparing these two migrations that a very important part of our life is missing. That is when I stumbled over a friend that's trying to find out his origins. And then I thought, oh, what about me? And what would be the situation of my children after 100 years? Would they know where I came from? How would they know it? Because my history started now. My history does not start now. But, well, in this recording systems, and when I came to Sweden, well, I got asylum, and then I got the numbers. Is that enough? It's not enough. At least for my children to know, and for my grandchildren to know where I came from. And for everybody. And that is something we have to start now writing and trying to record in a way that we can preserve them for the future generation. And then there were challenges when we came here of integration, as I said before. The language was one. The weather was another. The food was another. Even the type of clothes we are using was another. And even the culture. So many things, because we don't share any border with this country. We came from a desert or semi-arid country, and then we came immediately into a situation where snow comes, falling down like a white paint on top of your head, and then you slip, find a slippery on the road. You need special clothes and special shoes and special protection for yourself, which we do not know unless we make mistakes. And then the language, which the Somalis say one of the most difficult languages in the world. What can we do about this? Is there anything we can find out from the Swedish migration in America which we can apply to solve the problems of the Somalis in terms of integration in Sweden? Yes. One of the things is that language is very important to integrate. Unless you know the language of the host nation, it will be very difficult for you to move anywhere further into the depths of these systems. You cannot go in. You will always be blocked somewhere. Because the language is the one which connects you to the people, is the one which makes you share with other people, something with other people. But socialization. Without socialization, how can language be promoted, be built, be nurtured? How can one understand? How can one build his vocabulary and his linguistic, or say language skills, let me say, not linguistic, but language skills, ability to talk to others. In the Swedish context, socialization was not a problem, although they had their own meeting points and concentration areas where they can get together. But still, they were moving in, trying to at least carve themselves inroads into the social or societal structures. And one of the things, the secrets they have been using was the language. Those who did not have the mastery of the English language were cut off and left behind. And more often, it was seen in America that the people who were the immigrants, not only the Swedish, but every immigrant coming to America, those who are catching fast with the language were those who are moving faster into the system of the American life and the cultural life. So where is the meeting point of the immigrant and the host nation's medborgare, let's say citizens? Where is the meeting point? Because socialization cannot start without a point to meet. And if that space where people meet is not established, then you cannot meet. And it will be difficult to live together for two people who are living together and not meeting each other. It's quite difficult. Not in the case of the immigrants like us, but also for the svenskar, the medborgare, who are not getting access to the immigrants. So this project is trying to find out ways to establish some kind of a meeting point between these two groups, and then try to put people together in a frame of understanding and solidarity, so that no one will be recognized as he or she is black, or he's white, or he's Muslim, or he's a Christian, but people of the land that have got a common purpose to live together. Although people are allowed to stay and live with their own identities, cultures, heritages, languages, religions, It's no problem. But there must be a space where we all share as human beings. And if we are not available in that space, not present in that space, then we'll be cut off and always will stay in the margins. And one of the successes the Swedish people found out in America was that they pushed themselves into the system, try to understand the language and learn the language, and then establish contacts with the people, and then try to get jobs. And those who got jobs were those who better integrated with the system. One of the problems we have in Sweden is that we are few in the employment space, fewer in the educational space, and much, much fewer in the social space. But then how do we want then to come out from the shell and move into the system of catching up with the people and the language and whatever it is? So if we stay in the margins and not try to come into the forum where people meet, then I don't think we'll have any hope and future in this country. And if the Swedish people themselves blocking us from getting into the spaces of employment and education, and if the situation is quite hard for us to understand, and we get no support for that, then it will be difficult for them also to understand us and to live with us. So they must open up, and we must be willing to take advantage of that offer. So one has to open up, the other must accept this offer. And that's the way we can get together. So many complaints now coming from different directions in the Somali society, the Somali community, and in the Swedish community, that we are not finding each other anywhere in this big space of human rights, of solidarity, of nations, of coming together from all over the world. People are getting each other, but the Somalis and the Swedes are not finding each other anywhere, not meeting anywhere. And when I try to find out where is this problem coming, it seems that there's a misunderstanding between the two groups. That if you ask the Swedish, what do you think about the Somali? Then he would say, well, people who do not go to work, dropouts in school, chewing all the time, not working so much, living on welfare, maybe terrorism, accuse them of terrorism, and I have to avoid people who have already been branded that kind of a crime. Okay, and he has learned all these things from the press maybe. There's a bad press these days focused on us because we are the pirates, we are the terrorists, we are those people who are making so much of trouble in the world. It's a negative impression given to the world by the press, and we don't know how to change that. And that is where the source from which people learn other people most often is the media. And that is what the media says to the Swedish people. And then I asked the Somalis, what do you believe about the Swedish people? To find out if they have the same negative opinion against the Swedes, or if they have some kind of positive opinion. And try to find out ways I can bring them together, or my organization can bring them together, and my colleagues, and in this integration on migration and integration, migration stories project, find out a way we can bring them together. And then when I asked them what is the problem, and then they cited a number of complaints and said the Jewish people are quite silent, they are quiet, they are evasive and not giving you a very long space so that they can keep you at bay. And then not so open, always suspicious in terms of their looks and in terms of their utterances when they say some words about you. And employment is very hard, you cannot get. One man, I read from the websites, he said, I nearly changed my name from Abdisalam to, I don't remember his name, maybe Abdisalam, from that name to Andish. Because if I apply with my name, they don't give me a job. I thought one time, because I have already applied 200 200 or maybe more than that jobs. And they said negative, gave me negative responses. And at last he said, I thought that I should change my name to Andish so that they will give me a job. Can you imagine? That is torture. I have read that story from Somaliska.com in Fagersta, run by Mr. Jamale, a very prominent, very active and dynamic chap who has opened NPC, National Progress Center, Business Center, something like that. So he was, I read, I don't know the man, but when I read, in fact, it moved me so much. A person that believes that even if he applies the job and he has got the skills and the qualifications of that job, is still not the one who should be given that job, but still they prefer other people. And he thought that he should change his name from his original Somali name into a Swedish name, Andish and Johan, something like that. That's really torture. And people who have got all that belief to the extent that they have to change their names is really not getting anywhere to integrate with other people. I'm very happy that that chap has got a job now. You can find out that story at the Somaliska.com. It's very, very, very pity. So the two people standing these two extremes, trying to live together, how can we bring them together? That is the reasons behind this project, to at least go back to the migrations of 150 years ago, and then try to find out what can we learn from these migrations, and then try to apply it into the context of the Somali integration situation of Somalia, of Sweden. And that is the conclusion of the second part, and I thank you very much. All the best to you. Hej då.